Welcome to Progenesis Academy webinar. For those who are not familiar with Progenesis Academy, we are a non-profit, non-biased program dedicated to providing education for the IVF community with a particular interest in embryology. Our webinar are found on our website, progenesis/academy, or on our YouTube channel, Progenesis Academy. Today's topic is ways to improve KPI. We have a fantastic panel of laboratory directors who are going to help us navigate this very important exercise. And we have with us Dr. Sheila Ali. She is the laboratory director at Dallas IVF. And we have Dr. Sharon Anderson, and she is the laboratory director at Mainline Fertility. And we have Dr. Zaki Behan. He is the laboratory director at Fertility and IVF Center of Miami. Thank you so much for joining us. First speaker would be Dr. Ali. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me, and good evening, everyone. So today's topic is excellent, ways to measure and improve key performance indicators specific to an IVF setting. So if we can go ahead and move forward to the next slide. There are many different experience levels in our audience. So I just want to go ahead and just define what key performance indicators are so that everyone understands what we're talking about. Performance indicators are objective measures for evaluating critical healthcare domains. And they may be patient safety measures, effectiveness, equity, patient-centeredness, timeliness, and efficiency. If you can hit the next key. And so KPIs in ART, or assisted reproductive technology, are highly necessary to monitor and evaluate laboratory contribution to patient care. After all, our outcome measure is patient success, but more importantly, we want to make sure that within the lab, our outcome measures that are not necessarily the big outcome of live births, we're measuring that our performance as far as technologists or so certain benchmarks we set in the lab are being maintained at a certain quality. So KPIs are an important measure or element of your quality management program, which of course is a large part of any regulatory body that monitors your laboratory, for example, CAP or CLIA. So it's important to establish a minimum standard for proficiency and then measure where you stand according to that minimum standard. And monitoring ongoing performance and benchmarks are key and critical to make sure that you are meeting those minimum standards and are shooting to aim above those standards. Quality improvement also stems from that. So once you have a threshold, then you know how high to aim. Currently, CAP and CLIA don't have a set KPI requirement, meaning that it is left up to the laboratory's discretion to then assess their particular laboratory and determine what KPIs fit best for their particular lab. Next slide. So when you're determining what KPIs to set for your particular lab, some of the things to consider are what measures are the most beneficial for your facility. Every lab is different, and within that lab, certain populations of patients or technologists may be different, and those things are important to consider. For example, staff skill is a big one. You may go to a lab that has senior level staff that has been doing embryology or andrology for a long period of time. So then, setting low level outcome measures are maybe not fit. And so maybe outcome measures or key performance indicators should be set at a much higher standard. Whereas for a lab that has many more junior level embryologists or less skilled personnel that are developing their training and skills, then some of the lower KPIs may be a better fit. So to judge your staff and to judge your situation is key. Patient population is also very important, and so is technical offering, and then physician skill experience is just the same. Do you have new recruits, physicians right out of fellowship that are just now testing the waters, and then you have senior level physicians that you may need to possibly consider outcome by physician. And so if you'll hit next, please. So CAP gives some guidance on quality indicator monitoring. These are just some of the factors that they recommend, just as examples that labs can use. For example, patient specimen ID, critical value reporting, customer satisfaction, and test order accuracy. One of the things that CAP does emphasize is that when setting KPIs, the things that you must include or a lab must include are pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical testing processes. So make sure that you define what those processes are, and within those criteria, what KPIs fall within which arm. Next. And specific to, if you'll hit next, please. And then specific to IVF lab setting, here are some of the more routinely used KPIs, and I'll go over some of them and give examples. So ongoing pregnancy rates, it's a very common one. ICSI fertilization rates, especially within intertech comparisons. Morphology comparison, whether that be for embryos or for sperm morphology. Blastocyst development or conversion rate is also a big one. Euploidy or aneuploidy rate of embryos. It's critical because it obviously helps you understand that your biopsy technique and cell ablation technique is where it should be. Blastocyst recovery rate post survival, like post freeze thaw, is also critical to your FET program, especially nowadays where majority of the centers are having high number of frozen embryo transfer cases. Next slide. So how do you, once you set your KPIs and you determine which ones are critical and best fit your lab needs, it's important to understand how to use them. So we are in an era of data at our fingertips. So many things are automated, data can come quickly to us, but it's very important to know how to use this data and how to understand what your data is trying to tell you. Because if you are just using the data to say, yes, we passed or no, we don't, you can't quite understand, well, what is causing this data or how are we going to improve? So monitor, one of the key aspects is to make sure that you have a set period or set frequency in which data is being monitored. For example, if you monitor your KPIs twice a year, it's probably not frequent enough and you won't be able to decipher, you know, where is, it might be too late before you find that there was an error at all. And so quarterly at minimum and monthly is definitely something that's more advisable. Next. And so when outcome thresholds are found to be below what your minimum standards are, one of the most useful resources that I found are root cause analysis. And CAP has a great document that I've referenced right there, and it goes over steps to identify how to, one, find a problem, and then two, steps to come to a solution. So 5 whys. You may ask yourself, well, okay, now I have a problem. Why did this happen? For example, you know, let's just say a retrieval took longer than it should. Then you might say, well, why did this happen? So you might you might come to the conclusion that the embryologist had to double check all tubes or triple check all tubes just because she forgot that she'd already double checked them. Well, why did that happen? And then, you know, just going down this process of why, you might come up to the conclusion that, oh, the embryologist had been working through her entire shift without a break or a lunch break. And that might be key, you know, just to prioritize your workday, to set some time apart to give your staff maybe a quick 15-minute break in which they can just take a breather. And then when they return back to work, perhaps they're more focused. Next slide, or next, please. And so once you determine the source, you might want to think about, well, how do I solve this problem? So if the source is the technician, then perhaps consider remedial training, especially in a setting where you've done an intertech comparison. Other sources are also possible, for example, procedural gaps, or consider where you might want to consider updating your protocol, consumables or device related issues. Maybe your staff needs remedial training in or a device in service, so that way they are using devices properly. Workflow changes are also something that probably needs to be visited at least biannually, just to determine, well, has have we gone through major changes? Can we change our scheduling or our workflow to then best utilize our time? Accuracy of data is a big one. You have this data, but is it accurate? What are you assessing? So it's important to understand that there aren't any transcriptional errors and the data is accurate, and then you can obviously move forward to coming up with solutions. Shift in patient demographics happen. Sometimes, your first quarter maybe patients with a more younger population. Next quarter maybe some patients that have a more serious diagnosis, which is causing your rates to shift. So it's important to understand if your data is explainable, and if it's not, then obviously come up with a solution on how to correct the problem. So looking at your data through variables such as diagnosis, egg number, or age are also key to making sure that you truly do understand the scope that you're working with. Next slide. And so some of the examples that I have is, one, you can look at KPIs by art, for example, by technician, excuse me. So fertilization rate's a big one. Next. And so here I show a table in which I have multiple uses of how to look at this. So of course, this is a 6-month period in which I'm evaluating this data by technician. And so we're looking at number of M2s injected, and then we're looking at abnormal FERT rate, normal FERT rate, and the number of, and also the number of eggs injected by technician. So here, of course, I want to understand, okay, well, are we meeting the threshold? Are the technicians within range for each other? So one, where we don't have this large difference between technician performance. And then 2, every technician meets the minimum benchmark. But I also use this as a tool to praise and appreciate my staff. So for example, I highlight the highest normal FERT rate. So the technician that's giving me the best, or at least performed the best in that category. So it just gives a little bit more appreciation to the people that are working very hard for us. And then also the number of eggs injected. So technician 2, although wasn't the highest rate of fertilization, had 100 more eggs than the next highest number of eggs injected technician. So that's important. It says something that, and these are all eggs combined. So all qualities, all age groups. So obviously you'll see some variation, but within range, obviously they're all within 5%, which is all acceptable. So here I didn't find that there was anything to correct, but we were meeting our benchmarks. Next slide. And so here we also look at embryo morphology comparison. So you'd be surprised how, once you learn morphology and you become, it becomes a routine part of the embryologist's daily workflow, it's so easy to, over time, have a small shift in how one grades because it is a subjective part of your assessment. So what I usually do is find random pictures of embryos, either in text or online, and just create a collage, such as the one that you're seeing, and then number each one of them. And then I give a worksheet. And so of course, this has to be something quick and easy and not burdensome. So usually during our downtime, I'll give them this picture and say, hey, do like a quick 5-minute grading of these embryos. And then the highlighted red is where there's an agreement across that row. And then the white are disagreements. So for example, let's look at embryo number 8, which is more concerning. So for number 8, 2 technicians graded that embryo as a poor quality early blast, but 2 of the other technicians graded that same embryo as arrested. Same thing for number 7, 2 technicians graded that embryo as arrested, and then the other 2 as a fair quality morula. So that right there was concerning to me, which tells me that, hey, what's going on? Why are some of us confused as to whether or not this embryo is alive? So doing a little bit more digging, I found that, well, we don't grade embryos on day 3 any longer. So technicians are not used to seeing that compacted morula. And so this is unique and different to me. So we, of course, talked about that. There was some remedial training that came out of it, because obviously we don't want to discard any embryos that are alive, but our technicians are grading them as arrested. Next slide. Blastocyst development rate is also one of the more common ones. I really do like to use any available resource that provides me an automated result at a click of a button. So for example, most EMRs will come with a query engine of sort. And so here what I did is I used our EMR's query engine, put a date range of 1 year just to quickly assess, well, what's our blastocyst conversion rate? So here we see that for the period of that year, there were a total of roughly about 4,500 blastocysts created, or 4,600. And of those, 2 PNs created, and then of those, 58% converted to blastocysts. And so I wanted to just make sure at a quick snapshot, so this is a very broad spectrum. So if that, and that's all patients and diagnosis combined. So if that threshold was below what I was expecting, then of course I can subdivide that by age group, or subdivide that by physician, or any other variable that will then help me understand the next piece. So this is just a starting point and gives you a great KPI to look at. Next slide. And so euploidy rate is, of course, critical because the majority of the clinics across the US are using PGT at a very high rate. So our clinic is about 80 to 85% PGT. Progenesis has an excellent portal for clinics, if you'll hit next. And they quickly provide live data for us to look at, which compares our clinic to everyone else who's using Progenesis for their PGTA. So this right here shows you at its quick visual, which is easy to understand, that the blue area is our data. That's our center's euploidy rate for all biopsies submitted compared to all clinics that use Progenesis. So we can see at, in an instant that we're above the national or the average for all clinics, which puts your mind at rest that you're performing, above what the average is. You can look at other factors such as mosaic rates, which tells you more information. And then perhaps, you can, if your mosaic rate is too high, perhaps you can consider looking at your particular protocols and making sure that there isn't any technician related factors that are influencing those rates. But so if you'll hit next, another something that I like with Progenesis is that they provide this amazing data right there. So this piece of information tells us that by patient age group for our center, if the patient has, for example, that the very last column greater than or equal to 42, and then on the right hand side or on the y-axis you see the number of embryos. So for a patient greater than or equal to 42, if we have 1 to 2 embryos, we have roughly about a 20% chance of having 1 transferable or euploid embryo. So this is a great resource to provide to our patient that is specific to our center. So that way patient satisfaction is one of the important KPIs. So we can give as much information to our patient prior to his or her cycle, so that way they're satisfied with the outcome, and on the back end, they're not surprised of what the outcome is. This, through this portal, of course, this is easy information to access, and I certainly am very grateful to have that. So for people who don't know of it or aren't using it, great resource. Next slide. So the last thing that I want to talk about is blastocyst recovery rate or survival rate, because the majority of the clinics are now using a high number of frozen embryo transfer cycles. So some of the key things to look at is, just by cycle or by the total number of embryos warmed or blastocysts warmed or that survived. You want to look at, our minimum is 95%. We'd like to see at least 95% of embryos survive. So for 2019, because I was looking at live birth data also, I saw 98.8% of embryos that were frozen then survived as well. But of course, that's, you want to go a step further and just make sure that implantation rate is not impacted, or clinical ongoing rate and live births are not impacted. So when pooled all together, of course, not segregated by patient age, we see that, for all clinical pregnancies, we had a 63.8% pregnancy rate, which was, above our threshold for all patient combined. And then the live birth rates were also within acceptable limits. So those factors are important when you're looking at the large grand outcome of live births, because obviously that's our goal. But the minimum performance indicators are critical to be met within the laboratory also. So key here is, one, identify what's important for your particular laboratory and subpopulation, and then how to assess your data, and then how to improve upon the data that you have. Next slide. And with that, I'd like to thank the opportunity that I have today to present to you from Progenesis. Thank you to Dallas IVF for allowing me to use their data, and of course the audience for being here and listening in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. And now our next speaker is Dr. Zaki Bayhan. Zaki, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nabil. First of all, good afternoon all, and I'm happy to be here with you all. I always enjoy being part of these webinars. These are excellent resources for us in the field. And I like to extend my appreciation to Nabil and Progenesis as well for providing us this platform to come together and discuss our interesting and important matters. And having said that, I'm going to just get into my presentation, and I'm going to basically piggyback on Sheila's excellent introduction. So she has given an excellent introduction, so I don't have to probably spend too much time on the first few slides, and then directly get into how we apply the concept in our setting, and then take the discussion from there on. As she mentioned, these key performance indicators are the concept of key performance indicators becoming headlines in our field in the last several years, I should say. Especially in 2017, ASHRA embryology group came up with a number of suggestions, and last year in fertility and sterility we have a very good set of publications that just came out, and then discussing these issues. As I mentioned, I'm not going to spend too much time on this period, but I like to highlight a couple of things in terms of KPI identification and some aspects to those on top of what Sheila mentioned. When we are identifying our KPIs, we are basically depend on our original setting, and we have to go with that. But what I would like to underline is that these KPIs that we are identifying should be relevant to the processes we are trying to address or assess, and they should be measurable and reproducible. And from my point of view, most of all, it should be actionable. So once we get a set of data out there, and then we identify any problems or any trends that are just taking us to a certain direction. So we should be able to, based on this data, we should be able to take actions basically. If there's data out there, once you get it, if you don't know what you're going to do about it, it is not very helpful at that point. Basically, it's going to be a data just looking at you, but you're not going to be able to do anything about it. That's why when we are just identifying our indicators, these procedures should be in mind basically. In terms of reproducibility of this data, another thing I should underline here is that as you all know, I mean, we work with a population of patients and population of biological material huge that carry huge variation. And that is going to be basically reflect itself in every single process we are just doing. Every indicator or performance indicators we're going to be just trying to assess, that is going to be a big part of it. In that sense, generally it is suggested, and also pretty reasonable to work with. I mean, when we are just assessing those KPIs, is working with a population, with a subpopulation that basically reduces this variability. In that sense, I mean, in a given day, if you're just going to put all these data or KPI data coming from every single patient, every single biological material you're dealing with, is gonna give you a data set that's going to be really hard to work with. In that sense, generally working with a subgroup of data, which you expect. I mean, in our case, we call them good prognosis patients or good prognosis cases. So if you identify those and then look at those cases as the basis of your performance indicators, and then your assessment, that is going to reduce the variability. And I think this is going to create a better environment to work with in terms of these performance indicators. Again, I'm going to just can we go to the next slide, Nabil? Okay, again, after Sheila, I'm just piggybacking on Sheila's introduction. So I'm going to just jump into this graph. This is coming from a fertility and sterility paper that came last year. This is our typical. This is basically showing us how to approach the general KPI assessment. This is our good old Levy-Jennings plot. Whatever your key KPI you are dealing with, I mean, you're going to just basically plot this data over the time. And another aspect of this is just basically setting up certain limits in terms of what we are looking for in terms of the ranges, and where and at what point we are supposed to start worrying about our data and try to do something about it. So this is a very generic type of graph. But once we put those data in our system, in our evaluation, this is again, I mean, this is a generic graph. It doesn't have to be, you know, this 2 standard deviation, 3 standard deviation marks is going to be defining your warning or out of control limits. These are all basically depends on your KPI, specific KPI, and also the your laboratories laboratory processes, special features, characteristics. It doesn't have to be 2 SD, 3 SD limits, but at one point you have to, I mean, we have to define a threshold where we started to think that the process we're dealing with is not going as it is supposed to be. As you can see here, I mean, they use 2 standard deviation and 3 standard deviation for warning and control limits. So if you just look at those data on a regular basis, if you monitor them, at one point we're going to be able to just see what's happening, and at one point, if it is out of our warning limits, we should be just paying more attention. But if in time it goes worse and then get out of control, then we're supposed to do some you know, review of the process and then do some corrective action to put this process back in control. And also with these type of charts, always we're going to be able to identify certain trends and improvements as well. This is, in that sense, I mean, this type of approach is pretty helpful. And in our laboratory, this is what we use basically. And in certain cases, I mean, this is another aspect when it comes to those KPIs. I mean, we should update those depending on the performance, how the performance evolves. In certain cases, certain KPIs can improve depending on what's happening in the lab. So your training program takes over, and then you started to you know, see a significant improvement in your KPI. Then it is time at that point it is time to reassess your thresholds, and then reassess those lines you're talking about. And this is going to be a incentive to push our overall approach to improving quality in the lab. So this is generally what we do in our lab. Nabil, can we go to the next one, please? Thank you. At the Fertility and IVF Center in Miami, we monitor a number of KPIs. Actually, if some of them are related to structure, some of them related to processes, some of them are basically outcome related KPIs. at both laboratory and clinic level. Especially these outcome-related KPIs are intermingled with a lot of other factors. It's not directly what's happening in the lab, but what's happening in the clinical side. What is the patient characteristics? What happened to the patient and those biological materials before they ended up in the lab? So in that sense, so this is when we are looking at those, we have to keep that in mind. For this presentation, I'm basically gonna focus on the outcome-related KPIs in the lab for the sake of time and brevity. The others are again, these are something we regularly monitor, but I'm not going to discuss those here, at least at this setting. So during the discussion, if they come up, we're going to just get into those as well. And in terms of those KPIs in the lab, the KPIs we are using pretty much overlaps with what is suggested in the literature, and these are basically defined by ASHRA, and then later in the fertility and sterility papers. These are the data according to our understanding as well. It makes a lot of sense. Here, let me give you a little information about the charts. We're going to look at it. You're going to see in each chart, you're going to see two different data sets. One is going to be, say, we're looking at a 2 years data set here. We do our assessment on a quarterly basis, and one data set is going to be covering the whole period, and the other one is going to be halfway through. This is because some of these data is started to be entered in in our database after I took over the lab, so that is the difference. When we are looking at these straight lines on the top and bottom of the actual data are our threshold values. These are based on these are set up based on our original data, and again, we try to update those as needed. But these are the current thresholds we are using it. In terms of two data sets, the longer data set, the data set that covers the longer period of time is coming from every single cycle going through our clinic, basically. And the other one, I mean, the shorter one is the one I'm referring to at the beginning of my presentation. I mean, those reference values. These are the patients. These are the biological materials coming from the patients, according to, at least to our knowledge, have the least variability. These are the good prognosis patients. Of course, it's a smaller set compared to the whole group, and we expect them to perform better, and most of the time they do. And these are going to be a better indicators of what's happening in the lab, and try to at least eliminate some other factors, just like age-related oocyte quality issues, sperm-related quality issues. In that sense, that right now we are just collecting and looking at the data at two levels. Another aspect, I should say, I didn't present any of them here, but every single data you are seeing here is basically assessed per embryology technician basis as well. And as I said, it becomes a very great tool in terms of competency assessments and finding out or addressing problems related to individual embryologists and technicians as well. I am not presenting those here, but this is a part of our evaluation process. As you can see here, the first chart we're looking at it, maturation rate for our we are all ICSI practice, by the way. Let me mention that we don't do conventional IVF. Everything presented here is going to be an ICSI case. Maturation rates roughly, give you an idea about the incoming oocytes and the biological material. But again, I just don't want to overread too much on this data, because this could be affected artificially by how the physicians are collecting those follicles, how they are assessing those follicles. And that's a good idea to keep an eye on it, but it is I don't want to overread too much with this type of data. One of the important, if you're doing a lot of ICSI, Nabil, can you go back to the previous? I'm sorry. Okay, if you're doing a lot of ICSI, one of the major KPIs you wanted to look at is basically degeneration or lysis after ICSI, after ICSI is completed. That is dependent on a number of factors. The embryology technician competency could be a major contributor, and also oocyte quality could be another one. We wanted to keep those degenerations around less than 10 for sure, and then to keep around 5% or so. In the last 2 years, this is our average roughly, and we don't see a major difference between those reference subpopulation versus the whole population, basically. Next one. Okay, in this slide, we're looking at the fertilization rate, which is another important KPI as related to especially ICSI procedures. And also we still do day 3 grading. That is also a part of our program, and one of the KPIs we look at it. In terms of ICSI procedures, we wanted to keep our levels more than 75%. And in the last 4 or 5 quarters, as you can see from this chart, I mean, we just basically push those numbers quite a bit. And right now we are averaging about 80%, 85% level. So I think for us it is just time to just reevaluate this and then try to push our boundaries a little better. As you see here, the yellow line is representing our reference population. As we expected, they are generally perform better than our overall population. When it comes to day 3 grading, the same structure is here. Basically, what we are plotting here is basically fair to good grade day 3 embryos. Basically, on day 3 checks, if the embryos are just graded as fair to good, these are the rates we are just plotting here. And again, we wanted to just keep those around 65 to 80%, and in that sense, we are meeting our criteria, and our reference population is doing better, not surprisingly. Next one, please. Here we're looking at the blastocyst conversion rates and blastocyst utilization rates. At the top graph, we are looking at the same 2 data sets again. We wanted to keep our blastocyst development rates between 50%. I mean, this we set up here 40, but I mean we wanted to keep around 50 to 70%. Again, we see our reference group is performing better. I mean, I would like to underline this. This reference population is just taking out a serious amount of variation, and this is going to be a better indicator of what's happening in the lab, and just trying to remove other factors introduced by patient related or biological material related variation, basically. So that's another thing. I just wanted to underline that one again. When we are looking at the bottom one, it is a blastocyst utilization rate. These are either transferred or frozen blastocysts, and we wanted to keep those at the same level. Of course, in our case, we see the same type of relationship. We're talking about 52% blastocyst utilization rate in the normal patient population, and that is just approaching the 58 to 60% in our reference population. Next one. As far as the vitrification and FON and FETs are concerned, the two major KPIs we are looking at are, as Sheila was mentioning, survival post-warming survival rates and post suboptimal blastocyst rates. We wanted to keep them as close as possible to 100%, and we have a very well-established vitrification system. And what we are looking at is 80 more than 85% of survival rate on these. In this group, I didn't have that reference population. These are coming from our regular patient population, basically. And this is pretty close to what we want basically. The other one, another KPI we just would like to keep track of it is that once you thaw and recover those embryos, most of the time, I mean, if the process is taking place properly, you would expect those embryos to recover to the state they were before the freezing. And of course, in certain cases, that doesn't happen. We call them suboptimal blastocysts. They generally transferred anyway as long as they're alive, but we wanted to keep those suboptimal blastocysts, less than 10% basically. And as you can see here, we in the last couple of quarters, we were able to push those down a little bit, and this is another key indicator we would like to keep track of. Next slide, Nabil, please. Here we are looking at our biopsy and PGT data. The main indicator we look at here is the no DNA or no amplification type of biopsies. These are generally related to technician competence, and we would like to just keep track of it and then take any corrective action if needed. And when we look at embryologist specific data in that sense, you're going to see differences, and we use those plots to address the issues and try to address the problems related to biopsy technique or loading. I mean, this is rather than biopsy, at least in our setting, related to sample loading techniques, basically. And in many cases, we were able to identify those problems and correct them based on these plots. In that sense, it is pretty helpful. And again, when it comes to PGT euploidy data, I also use heavily Progenesis Portal. That's a very useful, very nice resource available. I'd like to underline one important opinion. I should say it's opinion of mine, actually, when it comes to looking at the euploidy data. I see, just looking at the euploidy data as a whole, I have some difficulty understanding to keep it as a KPI, because it just comes down to one of the issues I underlined at the beginning. This, actionable indicators. For instance, if you get a say 5% or 4%, 5%, 10% lower euploid embryo rate compared to the peer data. So what are you going to do? I mean, what is the action? What is the action you can take on that one? This is, I mean, when we look at the literature, there are a number of data available. Some suggestions are out there, like using single-step media, continuous single-step media, or sequential media, using certain biological material in the system or not. I mean, but none of them are basically, at least to my understanding, none of them are basically conclusive data. And by looking at the quality of those data, is not none of them are very strong evidence to show that, I mean, the euploidy rates in a given laboratory can be related to certain. Hypothetically speaking, theoretically speaking, definitely it's understandable. Certain laboratory practices can influence the segregation of the chromosomes. It can cause the aneuploidy, the mosaicism. Hypothetically speaking, yes, but I don't see a strong evidence to suggest that. In that sense, I mean, I don't see just looking at the euploidy rates as a actionable KPI. We still keep a look. We still keep an eye on those, of course, to keep if you are in a similar standing with the rest of the peer group. And if you see, especially in the patient by patient cases, if you see a significant deviation from the expected rate, we just use those data and then look at the patient by patient cases. But just by looking at the euploidy data, we don't use it as a KPI to address issues in the lab, basically. The next one, please, Nabil.
Yeah.
Once we have a problem, what we need to do is just sit down and then review the process, identify the probable causes, take the corrective action, keep monitoring the same issues to see if there's an improvement, and depending on how it goes, you can reassess the thresholds. Again, there were at the end of this slides, I have a couple of papers that is covering this area of concern pretty nicely, basically. And now we can just go to the next slides. I'm just finishing up. And again, I mean, we're gonna keep an eye on. It's not an eye, but we're gonna just keep both eyes on this key KPIs, basically. And these are great indicators, and these are gonna give us really powerful tools to address the issues and then identify the problems even before become a major issue, major problem for us. That's why these are important, and we have to just pay attention and make those a main and significant part of our quality management and quality assessment program. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zaki. And our next speaker is Dr. Sharon Anderson. Sharon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, so first slide, please. Okay, so I'm Sharon Anderson. I'm the lab director at Mainline Fertility. You can hit the next button, please. So I'm going to tackle this kind of from a different angle. I have a very strong interest in statistics, and we have a very strong research program. So I work with a university statistics department and data visualization. So during this short seminar, I'm just going to kind of go through the hows and the whys of how we monitor our key performance indicators, which are actually the key to continuous improvement in the ART lab. And we all know that it's a very important component of our QM that's required for CLIA, for CAP, and they always define it. You have to be looking at your numbers, pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical. They don't tell you what those KPIs must be, but they do recommend that you monitor them at least twice a year. Next slide, please. So when are we looking at KPIs, why, and how? So you can use them when you're introducing a new technique or process in your lab. And you can also use them when establishing your minimum standards for competency for embryologists. And you can, instead of just looking at it twice a year, you can look at it monthly, quarterly, yearly. And again, why? It's just for continuous quality improvement. And I'm going to talk about how we do this in our lab, how we do the data collection, how I do the analysis, the importance of interpreting the data correctly, and then investigating, and then making changes. You can do this with training or just implementing best practices. Next slide, please. So the first question is, what data should we be collecting? And if you think about it, it could be just about anything that will affect your outcomes. So this is just an example of one of the databases that we designed. And okay, what affects patient outcomes? So I have a section in the database that's just about patients. So we look at the age, AMH, the diagnosis. Then there's another section of the database that's the ovarian stimulation, because we know that that can affect egg quality and then subsequent embryo quality. So things like days of stimulation, the type of stimulation, your peak E2 and P4 on day trigger, your type of trigger. For your egg retrieval, I track physician, I track embryologist. And by the way, for ovarian stimulation, we also track who manages the cycle, what physician is managing that cycle. And then we talked about, the other speakers talked about the importance of looking at fertilization, of course, and your vitrification and warming. But instead of just survival, we also want to look at what can affect that survival, like, what is your method? When you're importing embryos from other centers, what methods did they use? And put that into your database. What kind of devices are being used? And of course, the embryologist is doing the vitting and the warming. Biopsy, are we doing traditional biopsy? Are we doing flick? Who's doing the biopsy? And then for embryo transfer, not only is it physician, embryologist, but you can also track to see if blood, mucus, or number of attempts at the transfer affect your results. Next slide, please. So in terms of KPI, we talk a lot about rates. So we're looking at fertilization rates, blastocyst rates, and we interchange, I at least interchange these two words, blastocyst utilization rate or your usable blast rates. Those, that would be the embryos that are either transferred or frozen. And then we have our implantation rates and survival rates in our laboratories. Next slide, please. ICSI, very, very important KPI. But we should also track, who stripped the eggs? How long were they in the hiatus, perhaps? Because this is where you can have mechanical damage. You can also have mechanical damage during the ICSI procedure itself. And instead of only looking at just your fertilization rates, like everybody else said, you should look at your atretic or your degeneration rates, look at your abnormals, and then, of the ICSIs, look at, for example, for each embryologist, what is the usable blastocyst rates for each embryologist that did the ICSIs? And of course, you can look down the road at your pregnancy rates. Next slide, please. PGT is a hot topic. We, like the other speakers, we do track NR rates or no reading rates. And we also track euploidy rates. So we track that in the fresh cycles, and then in the frozen embryo transfer cycle, we'll track implantation rates. But I also think it's really important to look at your loss rates, track those biochemical pregnancies, track those miscarriages, and then again, think about what things can affect your outcomes. It's not only who does the biopsies, but also what PGT lab was used, your method of biopsies, and if you do see, maybe an embryologist might have a higher loss rate or something, you can even dig down deeper and even start tracking things as minuscule as how many pulses, how many laser pulses, do certain embryologists use to do the biopsies, and you can track that. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, we have our traditional outcomes, and again, mostly it's rates. I'm going to go to the next slide, please. Okay, so how do we collect this data? Traditionally, you can have a spreadsheet. Even if you have an EMR, these spreadsheets are kind of behind the scenes. So I think it's important to have the data in sheets, very separate sheets. I have a frozen cycle, I have a fresh, a frozen, a combination, and then also the egg thaws. So I have very different sheets where I store the data based on the cycle type. And this kind of matches back to SART too. SART is kind of set up the same way. Next slide, please. What are some helpful hints for clean data for those people who are entering the data into the database or into your EMR? One trick I do is when I design the database, I make sure that when the person's entering the data, I have sort of a little description there. What data am I looking for in that particular cell, just to kind of describe and remind the person who's entering the data. So that's on the left, add descriptions. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see I like to add drop-down options. So somebody hovers over a cell, there's a very specific drop-down. You need to select one of these. And these are very, very powerful in setting up very clean data that can be properly statistically analyzed. Next slide, please. Okay, so now after we've collected all of our data, whether it's in an Excel or in Access or in an EMR, how do you actually look at it? And this is something I picked up working with a graduate student at a university, somebody who is majoring in statistics. And they work a lot with a program called Tableau. And Tableau is a very powerful data visualization software. And it can take on many types of different databases. It can take on Excel, it can take on Access, whatever. It's interactive. It's something where you can share it online, you can share it on Zoom meetings, you can all log in, you can look at the data, you can play with the data, you can watch how your graphs change looking at different things. But it's very powerful that it helps you to see trends, see changes over time, and it helps you to explore your data. So, and once your Tableau is set up, then as your database changes, you can just upload your database every month or so, and you can just watch those graphs change in shapes, and you can see trends over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you have your data is collected, you have a way to analyze the data, then you have to set, what are your minimum standards, your competency values, and what's your benchmark, which is sort of what you're aiming for. So you kind of have a floor, your horizontal line. This is what you need to attain, competency. And then you, of course, the benchmark is you aim a little bit higher. So these are from, this table is from the Vienna Consensus 2017. So I think it's important to, when people are defining their KPIs, I think we should be using something that's published that our whole field agrees on. Next slide, please. Okay, so I have 3 examples of Tableau data. This is a graph comparing 3 different embryologists, and we know how we can look at the fertilization rates. You have your competency, 65% or so, and then you want to aim for about at least 75%. So we have 2 embryologists that are above the benchmark. One's a little bit lower. So then you dig a little bit deeper and you think, well, why is that embryologist not as high as the other embryologist? Well, let's look at the same time at degeneration rates. Let's look at abnormal rates. And we can see an embryologist A has a higher degeneration rate. What is that, 8.2% or so. Still within the 10%, but maybe, we would use this data and say, what are the other embryologists doing that have the lower degeneration rates, the higher fertilization rates? And maybe embryologist 1 should maybe watch what the other embryologist is doing. So it's a way of training, it's a way of improving, and always looking at your numbers. Next slide, please. Example number 2, we dig into the damage rate. And again, this would be actually what a Tableau screen would look like. So I want to take a screenshot of this. Is what it looks like. And Again, we can see one of the embryologists is having a higher damage rate. Okay, let's have the other embryologist watch the embryologist in yellow, and let's see if they can give that person some tips for how to reduce that damage rate. But it's also important that if you do see something like this, you have to go back to your data. You have to make sure that there isn't an outlier in there. Maybe there was a PCOS patient that was in that embryologist data set, and maybe that's why the degeneration rate is a little bit higher. So you see, you know, the key performance indicator, and then you investigate deeper and kind of ask why. Next slide. Okay, this is another common one. You know, let's look at, for a month, let's look at frozen embryo transfer, clinical pregnancy rates by the physician who did the embryo transfer. Okay, so the first thing you're going to see is, oh, wow, look, Dr. C is kind of low compared to the other physicians. But before, you know, we jump to any conclusions, it's really important to look at the N. What is your sample size? That doc had a 33.3333% rate because that person maybe only did three transfers. So really keep an eye on the N, your sample size. And you know, whenever I see bar graphs and looking at KPIs, I really love to see those N's, you know, on top of those bars, because it allows us to weight how important is that particular bar graph. Next slide, please. Okay, so helpful hints when interpreting KPI data. Be aware of your sample size or your N. If your N is too low, if it's too small, it's based on 2 or 3 cycles for one particular person, it's better to combine the data across time. So if you have a really large IVF center and you have a lot of cycles, thousands of cycles, you know, it's okay to analyze that data every month. But if you have a center that has maybe only 300 cycles a year, you start graphing each month, you're going to see 100% pregnancy, 5% pregnancy the next month, 75. It's up and down all over the place. So it's better just to combine so you have an adequate sample size of what you're looking at. And again, not only look at within a particular time frame, you know, look, you know, across time, look for shifts and trends. And Ziki did a great job explaining that, so I won't go any more into that. And if you do see a trend, it's really important to investigate. Is there a covariate? Is there an outlier? Go through your database. Look, is there a patient that's an outlier that's skewing the numbers, skewing that bar graph, skewing that data point on your graph? And like we all know that, you know, maybe an embryologist had a high number of older patients or patients with a really low AMH or a particular diagnosis. And that's why it's important to also monitor, you know, all the clinical information too, so you can kind of weed that out. Next slide, please. So do not use KPIs punitively. Don't use it, to point fingers at any physicians or embryologists. Do not set unrealistic expectations for the team. You know, you don't say, oh, I want to see 90% XE rates. No. Next slide, please. But what we want to do is we want to invest in accurate data collection and data entry. It's really important to, you know, the whole team really buy into the idea of data entry. Involve the whole team. Ask the nurses, ask the doctors, are you seeing any trends? Should we investigate anything? Can we see how this is affecting our outcomes? Do interpret the data correctly, learn what improves the outcomes, and then use that information to train personnel or to find the best practices and then implement those best practices to continually improve your outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, so in conclusion, monitoring KPIs, it really is the key to improving ART quality and outcomes. Next slide, please. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and email. I'm happy to explain any things I discussed further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We are going to launch a poll and we will allow the audience to vote for about 30 seconds, and then we're going to resume with the discussion. I'll start with you, Sheila. What do you think about the poll?
What do I think about, what was the last part?
The poll results.
Well, so there are common misconceptions in the industry, and I think the poll outlines a majority of them. So many, as managers, of course, we're presenting data to our staff and our physicians, et cetera, but how much of that data is actually retained because a majority of the staff members are just so busy working. I think then much of that data just, is presented quarterly maybe, and then just kind of goes away until the next time we meet. So I believe a lot of the answers are explainable because of that. But as far as, managers who are working with data constantly and looking at these trends and truly monitoring, well, okay, last month I saw this, or last week I saw this, and then now I'm seeing, some slight fluctuations here, just to be in front, get in ahead of, so to speak, any errors that could arise and cause a negative impact on outcome. I believe that because of that reason, we're understanding our data maybe at a higher level than some of the staff members. But of course, that's the goal of the presentation today, is to help everyone understand how these KPIs are used and why it's so critical to make sure that data entry is accurate, and so interpretation is performed correctly, and then we're trying to improve our overall outcome, and just just one little notch at a time, raise the bar, just so we can provide our patients the best quality outcome and that a little bit of a higher chance. So that's really the goal. But yeah, I'd love to see your data as far as the day 5 and the day 6 comparison for euploidy rate.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, I will get into that data shortly. Zeki, what's your feedback on the poll results?
Well, I completely agree with what Sheila says in terms of certain misconceptions. This is always, these type of issues always with us. And then even though we have some pollution in terms of availability of data, I mean, in every single concept we're talking about here, you go and do a literature search, you're going to find out a number of different opinions are represented over there. In that sense, I mean, coming up with a strong data, strong and reliable data set is always the solution to that. It's in that sense, I always try to look at try to get that type of information based on my own data, at least to have a better idea about my setting and address these in my setting, basically. In terms of the rest of the questions, I mean, these are each of them could be answered one at a time, actually, and also each of them are dependent on the specific structure of each lab, and that also underlie the fact that the setting up these expectations, KPIs, and evaluation of KPIs in our setting and in our environment, basically. This is going to be I believe this would be the take home from those poll data from my point of view.
Thank you so much. Sharon?
So what were the results from the question about how people track their KPIs? You asked about Excel. What was that breakdown again, especially with the EMR?
Oh, yes. So it looks like we don't have users for that. People who have voted don't use any software system. They don't use any AMR system. They just use mainly Excel or data table. So that's and we can probably bring that. That's what he was saying.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm surprised that more people aren't using their EMRs, or maybe the EMRs don't have the capability of generating the KPIs in a certain format that we typically analyze our data. So I think maybe a lot of people are, reverting back to, the old basic ways of just, old-fashioned collecting that data in an Excel spreadsheet. So
Very good.
yeah, I think there's a lot of room for improvement in how we look at these things.
Yeah. So to answer Sheila's question on day 5 versus day 6, so this is a table results, and I'm going to go quickly into this data. So we have day 5, we have 44,294 biopsies, and on day 6, we have 30,426. So you can see, if you take all ages combined, day 5 has 58.08% euploidy rate, while day 6 has 49.09, so about 9% differences between day 5 and day 6. And if we look at day 6 versus day 7, so we can search day 6 here and then day 7 here, I think we're gonna see approximately the same difference. Yeah, you can see day 6, 49 again, day 7 is 37. So about 9 to 10% difference between each age. The older you have embryos, the more time the embryos takes to form and mature, the more likely they're gonna be abnormal by 10%. Okay, and so this is the data. So I'm gonna go into the questions that were posted in the chat. The first question was, how often KPI should be measured? Is it monthly or quarterly, and why? And I'll start with you, Sheila. I know that you have answered the question, but since everyone is here, so we'll repeat.
Yeah, that's right. So as I mentioned, and Dr. Anderson had mentioned in her talk, that, it's important to measure KPIs. I believe, and I think it's a consensus for all of our speakers, that frequency is important, right? We want to make sure that you're monitoring KPIs at a set frequency, whether that be quarterly or monthly or biannually, yearly. What determines what best works for your setting and your lab is your volume. So if, like Dr. Anderson hit on that perfectly, that if you have a higher volume lab, it would make sense to perhaps increase your frequency of your data analysis, because you have, an abundance of cycles going through on a monthly basis or a weekly basis. Whereas the opportunity to miss something is higher than if you have a low volume lab where you're maybe doing 10 cycles a month. So then it would make sense to look at your data weekly, because, you're looking at 2 cycles, and I mean, your data can fluctuate between 100% to 50% to 0, which is so drastic, and it's not accurate. It doesn't necessarily provide any useful, actionable data. So the answer to the question is, it depends on the lab. It depends on the volume. It depends on the factors that are involved. So it really goes back to analyze your lab, your setting, and what works best for you. So for us, I usually do it monthly. And then if I'm seeing trends, just by looking at charts daily, et cetera, then I'll go delve in and look at a particular variable. But otherwise, it's definitely monthly, and then quarterly, and then again annually.
Yeah, thank you so much. So for sake of saving the time, we're gonna move into questions, and maybe each speaker will answer one question. And I'll start with you, Sharon. So one of the questions was the fact that embryo grading, so embryo quality and utilization rate, is subjective thing. Each embryologist has a different call. How can you take that into account when you're measuring KPI? Does it impact the quality of KPI?
Right. So of course, within an IVF center, the embryologist should be evaluating embryo quality pretty much the same. So, so I think it's important to track not only the utilization rates or those usable rates. I mean, I think that should be one thing that we're measuring. And again, those are the embryos that are transferred or frozen. But also we should be measuring the blastocyst rates. So If you look at the data, typically your utilization rates are going to be a little bit lower than your blastocyst rates. But I think to track both is important.
Yeah, but when you're grading, you can grade in a completely different way. If we ask you to grade an embryo and we ask another embryologist, there is a lot of variability in the grading system.
That's why we do proficiency testing. You know, that's why we participate in CAP and AAB proficiency testing, because it's, you know, one of the roles of the lab manager, the supervisors, the lab director is to make sure that the embryologists are all grading the embryos. I mean, not exactly the same, but pretty close. And Dr. Ali, she addressed that. It's part of the training. We should, there is some subjectivity, but we should all be pretty close.
Perfect.
Like blastylation rates, that should be pretty consistent. Then of course your utilization rates, you're going to track how many, you know, embryos you transferred and how many you froze. Now, when you freeze, yes, usually you only will freeze usually A's and B's, the better quality embryos.
Very good.
But it's consistent within a lab.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree. I think you have a very good point. The other question, and Zaki, if you want to answer any of the previous questions, feel free to do so. The next question is the N number. So how big the data should be in order to be accurate enough, an accurate measure of KPI.
Okay, I'm going to tell this one as well. My kids tells me that one of my favorite answers to almost any question is it depends. So again, this is the same. This is basically the same. It comes to the same. I'm going to come to the same answer. It depends on what type of data we are looking at. It's really difficult to tell. Okay, N number should be 20, 25, 26. It depends on variability. It depends on the population of population, the statistics. I mean, if you want to really be hardcore on the statistics, and there are calculators available for just look at your variability, the population variability in the population, and then you can just calculate those. But again, especially in small clinics, it's not going to be, you know, possible to just follow those N numbers. But again, when you are making a statistical analysis on those data, it should be basically it should give you enough power in terms of statistical value. You should be your N number. I don't know. I know that this is not a very clear answer, and I'm giving my favorite answer again. It depends. And also, if you really want to be doing the right thing, and you can just go ahead and calculate those N numbers, required numbers, and the powers you need for your statistics. These are all available resources at different locations in the internet, basically.
Very good.
So if I can make one real quick comment, and this is kind of a warning. You don't want to knee-jerk or make really drastic changes based on a small N. So I'll put that warning out there.
Yeah.
You know, and also you can also answer this question, you know, what is statistically significant? But most centers don't do statistical analyses, but don't knee jerk based on small N. Yeah,
very good. The next question came from Philip Chan, who was saying that could SART's data be a source of KPI measurements, and is it, you know, what do you think about the concept of getting SARTs to clinic more frequently so that they can adjust for their, use that as a source of feedback, KPI based feedback. Sheila, what do you think?
Well, so the way that I see SART is that obviously we're reporting to SART. We want to compare ourselves against a national average, but the thing is, not everyone's reporting data live. So that puts a critical binding side of sort of situation, because the purpose of KPIs is a quality management program that monitors live your outcome, your data, your performance in a periodic fashion, to where you can identify problems early on and then correct any deviations so that way outcome is not impacted. By the time we enter data and to start in a, I wouldn't say leisurely fashion, but as we get time, because obviously we are busy with work in the laboratory, then that data doesn't necessarily get back to us in time, or by the time that it does, it might be too late. So the way START is set up right now and how most clinics are entering their data, I don't see that that is useful immediately. Perhaps if certain modifications were made or EMRs were reporting live to START, that could be a useful tool in the future.
Very good. So when you guys are measuring KPI, and I'm gonna ask you, Sharon, because you mentioned degeneration rates, what do you attribute that to? Possible reasons.
Yeah, so we do want to track that by embryologist that's doing the ICSI. But if an embryologist does have a degeneration rate or an atretic rate greater than 10%, or if you start to see an uphill climb, you want to look at technique, but also equally important, if not more important, is to look at the raw data and look to see if there are any outliers in that data, because there could be one patient that had 30 eggs, might have been a PCOS patient with very poor quality eggs, and of course those eggs are very fragile, so you're going to see a really high atretic rate. So it's probably not even due to that embryologist technique, it's a patient effect. And that's the purpose of KPI, is you get the number, but then you need to interpret it and you need to kind of dig and do a lot of problem solving all the way down to the patient level.
Thank you so much. Sheila, you mentioned that patient population can skew the data when you are looking at KPI index. How do you adjust for that? How do you find out that the patient population, is it common first? And if it's common, how do you identify that, and how do you neutralize that bias from patient population?
Yeah, so some of the comments that the other speakers have made is a group answer to that question. So patient population can shift anytime. So if your KPIs are set and you've set your benchmarks according to the published literature, then it's always important to delve into your data. And if it's not, so first of all, you identify a problem when you do not reach your benchmark. And so if you're below your threshold, then you delve deeper. Okay, well, why? Why did I not meet my benchmark? So then you start analyzing your data, perhaps by age group or perhaps by patient diagnosis. And through that process, you'll discover, well, hey, my patient population has changed in that I have a higher percentage of my patients undergoing IVF that are PCO. And so then you can delve into that deeper and then maybe reference the literature again. Well, what is the published rate or accepted rate for, the KPI that I'm trying to measure within my region or within the IVF industry? And then perhaps adjust your thresholds based on your patient population, maybe by diagnosis, if that's how you want to, look at your data. But it's important to not make large changes without truly understanding your data and analyzing it from so many different angles to ensure that you truly do understand the factors that contribute to the results that you have.
Thank you so much. Another question, is it common to use stimulation data as an input for KPI? I know that, Sharon, you stressed out that question, and I would like to get your feedback, but let's start with Zaki first. Do you currently use stimulation data?
We don't use the stimulation data directly. It's an extremely valid point. I mean, we should look at it. But in our system, the stimulation protocols are pretty standardized, and we don't have a lot of variation, to be honest. That's one of the reasons we don't look at them very clearly. But it's an extremely valid point, and depending on what type of stimulation you are using, you can affect maturation rates to your oocyte quality, which is going to be directly related to your or degeneration rates, fertilization rates. It's absolutely a valid point, and it should be taken into account. In our setting, we don't do it rigorously because of the because we don't have a lot of variation in our stimulation protocols. That's what should I say.
And we have seen some differences in our data due to in clinical outcome due to simulation protocols. We don't know if it's simulation specific or is it patient specific, but we do see differences. Sharon, what give us your experience about monitoring stimulation protocol?
Yeah, so our center was involved with some pretty large clinical trials that were comparing stimulation protocols and also different FSHs on embryo quality and also euploidy rates. And you know, if we dig into the literature, we'll see you know, there is an effect of stimulation on embryos.
Fantastic. Well, we are approaching the end of the webinar. I would like to give you guys a minute to introduce your practice or your interest, and then maybe we can move into an announcement for next webinar and close the webinar session. And I'll start with you, Sheila. If you can introduce your practice, your clinic.
Oh, sure. So I direct a lab in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas called Dallas IVF. So we're located in the Frisco area. We have a total of 5 physicians. We're looking to add another to our team, and we have a total of 4 locations. So I'm just glad and grateful to be a part of this program and this webinar. Thank you for having me. I certainly do appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Zaki?
I'm the lab director of Fertility and IVF Center of Miami, and not surprisingly in the city, a great city of Miami. We have a 3-physician practice from small to mid-size, and we have a great team of embryologists and physicians, and we try to provide our services to South Florida population. And if you just come down to Miami, just please stop by, and we're going to have a discussion in the lab, and later on we can continue with over a pint.
Fantastic. Sharon?
So I'm Sharon Anderson, I'm the lab director and also the clinical research director at Mainline Fertility. 6 physician practice. We're located on the main line or outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. We have launched the second poll and we have the result now. We asked, did you find this webinar useful? 96% said yes. And we asked, do you want to see webinars like this in the future? And 100% said yes. This is by far the highest percentage we have received so far. I appreciate.
What is the N number, Nabil? What's the N?
Not that big.
Okay.
But we have about 43 attendees at the moment. That's actually a good record given the 1.5 hour webinar. So a lot of them have stayed long enough to get all the inputs from your guys, and I appreciate that. Well, with this, we are coming close to the end of the webinar. So next 2 weeks, we will have another webinar on navigating FDA regulation. We will be covering sperm and egg donors, as well as tissue bank. So if you are interested in learning about all the FDA aspects, this is a good webinar for you. With this, we're coming to the end of the webinar. I would like to present my gratitude and appreciation for each one of you, for you, Sheila, Zaki, and Sharon, for your valuable inputs. Thank you so much, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.